Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Alan Clifford of Norwich Reformed Church. As a Reformed pastor, I would like to share with you an amazing story from the time of the Protestant Reformation as it affects the history of North America. The title of my presentation is America's Heroic Dawn, the Huguenot Martyrs of Florida. A largely forgotten history reminds us that the first attempted Christian settlement in North America was by Huguenots seeking a haven from persecution in France. This follows the era of Christopher Columbus, whose first adventures to the New World date from 1492, soon followed by the Cabots from England a few years later. Not to forget the English Jamestown settlement of 1607, the Huguenot adventure occurred 60 years before the Pilgrim Fathers founded the Plymouth plantation in 1620. This was the era of Iberian domination, when Spain was the world's superpower. With the blessing of the Pope, Spain and Portugal laid claim to the New World. Their brutal Central and South American conquests brought justifiable opprobrium upon the cruel fascism of King Philip II and his ilk. Predictably, war was inevitable, as less compliant European nations resisted this evil and expanding tyranny. The Protestant Reformation fueled the animosity as anti-Catholic sailors from Normandy found courage to challenge Spanish arrogance. One form of resistance was to attack the Spanish treasure ships bringing gold and silver from Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere. Outraged by the cruel horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, hot-headed French pirates thought nothing of enriching themselves at Spain's expense. They were the scourge of the Spanish Main. The Spaniards called these high seas raiders Corsarios Luteranos, that is, Lutheran pirates. However, among these Protestant adventurers were more noble souls with more honorable aspirations, properly called Calvinists. Closely acquainted with John Calvin, the Huguenot leader Admiral Gaspar Coligny sent Jean Ribaut of Dieppe, an eminent sailor of strong Protestant convictions, on an expedition of discovery in 1562, and this is an engraving of this man. This high-principled man was no pirate, as one historian implies. So, after a voyage of 8 weeks, the explorers found a river estuary off the coast of Florida. Landing on the 1st of May, Ribaut and his sailors gave thanks to God for safe passage, commending also the native Timucuan people to God's mercy. They prayed, "We fell to the ground a little way from the native people, to call upon the name of God, to beseech him to continue still his goodness towards us, and bring to the knowledge of our Saviour Christ this poor people." This was the first Protestant prayer in North America. It reflects the missionary dimension of Calvin's usual end-of-sermon prayer, that God might, quote, grant his grace not only to us but also to all people and nations of the earth, bringing back all poor ignorant souls from the miserable bondage of error and darkness to the right way of salvation. Ribaut and his Huguenot brethren knew, as Calvin expressed it, that, quote, the advent of Christ was the time of Reformation, doubtless for the 1st and 16th centuries, and that, the figures of the Old Testament receiving their fulfillment in him, the whole world became an enlarged Mount Zion upon the advent of Christ. Naming the River of May, now the St. John's, formerly Spanish San Juan, near modern Jacksonville, Ribaut claimed the territory for France by setting up a monument in the name of the French King Charles IX. After further peaceful contacts with the native people, the Huguenot explorers sailed further up the coast to modern South Carolina, where another monument was set up. Leaving a settlement at Charlesfort, Ribot returned to France to report on his discoveries and organize another expedition. However, finding France in the throes of the tragic religious wars, he took refuge in England. Queen Elizabeth warmly welcomed him at first. After suspecting that this French patriot might be a threat to our security, she briefly imprisoned him. While in the Tower, Ribot wrote his account to his Huguenot master, Gaspar Coligny. This was 1563, and it was translated and published in English the same year. And here is a modern printed facsimile of that work. A noteworthy fact: this was a year before Shakespeare was born. The anonymous translator's English, doubtless influenced by Tyndale and the Geneva Bible of 1560, is very clear and vivid. Perception problems with the black letter type are soon forgotten as the reader feels gripped by the narrative, replete with colourful accounts of the local flora and fauna and the Native Americans. In April 1564, Ribot's second-in-command, René Ladonnière, sailed for Florida on a second enterprise. Their arrival in June began with worship. I commanded a trumpet to be sounded, that being assembled we might give God thanks for our happy and favourable arrival. Then we sang a psalm of thanksgiving unto God, beseeching him that it would please him of his grace to continue his accustomed goodness towards his poor servants, and aid us in all our enterprises, that all might turn to his glory and the advancement of our King. These enterprises enraged Catholic King Philip II, who, sanctioned by the Pope, claimed America for Spain. Regarding the French as interlopers, the fact that they were Protestants made them more intolerable. So in 1565, not before a Cuban expedition under Captain Hernando de Manrique de Roas destroyed Charlesfort in May 1564, the Pope commissioned devout Catholic Admiral Pedro Menendez de Avilés of Asturias to rid Florida of the Huguenot menace. Menendez's orders were to leave not a man alive, inflict on the heretics an exemplary punishment which all of their kind will remember forever. His hatred was also fired by the fact that the Huguenots were determined to free the inhabitants of Cuba who had been enslaved by the Spaniards. Despite kind help from the natives, internal problems and a delay of supplies from France, then in the grip of the First Religious War, meant that Fort Caroline was not looking a viable settlement. As desperation was setting in, ships under the command of Sir John Hawkins appeared in August 1565. Though offered a passage back to Europe, the French decided to accept a ship and supplies from the Protestant English in exchange for most of their cannon. Plans to abandon Fort Caroline ended when Ribot's second expedition brought supplies and reinforcements from France. Then, hard on the heels of Ribot's fleet, Menendez and his heresy hunters arrived off the Florida coast. Establishing a base at St. Augustine, named after the feast day of St. Augustine, he sailed north to oppose the French. After an inconclusive standoff in the St. John's estuary, Menendez returned to his base. Ribot and 500 of his men then sailed to attack St. Augustine. However, lashed by a hurricane, it was the hurricane season, shipwreck south of St. Augustine rendered Ribot's counter-offensive futile. A fortnight later, since there were few defenders, the Spaniards then attacked Fort Caroline overland. At dawn on the 20th of September 1565, Menendez and his men struck at the fort, inside which were women and children, all the sick, including René Ladonnière, and a handful of armed guards. Above 143 massacred bodies, Menendez placed a notice: "I do this not as to Frenchmen, but as to Lutherans." Besides taking supplies and ammunition, Protestant Bibles, books, and Reformed symbols were destroyed. Ladonnière and a few others escaped to tell the tale. Sailing in his ship the Greyhound, Ladonnière landed in Wales, in the port of Swansea, receiving succor from the people there before continuing back to France. He later wrote an account of Ribot's voyages and his martyrdom, an event we now relate. Tragically, with his vessels beached, Ribot and his men were eventually caught in the cruel grip of Menendez. The first group of survivors of his sunk and grounded ships tried to make their way overland to Fort Caroline, not knowing what had happened there. Scouts from St. Augustine observed them. Soon Menendez led 50 soldiers south to Anastasia Island. Surrounding the worn and bedraggled Huguenots, he offered to spare their lives if they would surrender. Battered by the sea and hungry, they agreed. After ordering their hands tied behind their backs, the Spaniard ferried his prisoners across the swamps to a place of execution. Soon 111 Huguenots lay dead in the sand. A second group headed by Ribot appeared a few days later. They too were slain at the same location. It was later named Matanzas, meaning Spanish for slaughters. In all, nearly 250 died. What is truly remarkable is the way all these French Protestants, without exception, maintained their profession of the Reformed faith. Over 4,000 miles from home, in an unfamiliar foreign land, they did not capitulate in the face of death. What a testimony to God's all-sufficient sustaining grace. A Spaniard named Solis Dumeras was an eyewitness of the massacre. He said, "Menendez took Jean Ribot behind the sandhills among the bushes. He asked if they were Catholics or Lutherans, or if any of them desired to make confession. Jean Ribot replied that all who were there were of the new religion. And he began to repeat the psalm, Domine, memento mei. And having finished, he said that from dust they came and to dust they must return, and that in 20 years more or less he must render his final account, and that Menendez might do with them as he chose." We must note that Jean Ribot recited, or possibly chanted, the words of Psalm 132. Charles Bennett remarks that the psalm that Ribot recited before the dagger was thrust into his body was this psalm, which begins, "Lord, remember David." But Ribot began it, according to an eyewitness, with "Lord, remember me." The psalm is highly significant, as David, anxious to build the temple, later built by Solomon, was concerned to find a resting place for the Ark of the Covenant and the pure worship of God. So Coligny, Ribot, and others desired to find a place in the New World to worship God in spirit and in truth, far from the superstitious and persecuting religion of Rome. Sadly, pursuing them across the Atlantic, their enemies gave them no peace, even in distant Florida. Thus, on that fatal September day in 1565, Ribot and around 250 others were America's first martyrs. Trusting to the certain purposes of their sovereign God, they knew, despite their fears, that their struggles and sufferings for Christ would never be in vain, a truth gloriously stated by John Calvin in his commentary on Psalm 132, where he says, "The greater that fear which seizes upon us when exposed to aggression from enemies, the more are we sensibly awakened to take hold of divine help. The passage teaches us that the Church and people of God will never enjoy such peace on earth as altogether to escape being assaulted by the variety of enemies which Satan stirs up for their destruction. It is enough to have it declared upon divine authority that their attempts shall be unsuccessful, and that they will retire eventually with ignominy and disgrace." And so it proved to be, as expressed by American poet James Russell Lowell, opponent of slavery and other injustices. "Careless seems the great avenger, history's pages but record. One death grapple in the darkness twixt old systems and the word. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own." For the sequel to this presentation, please see part 2 of this video.